The ice hit Austin, Texas at 3 in the morning, and by dawn I was already on my fifth emergency propane delivery run when I got the call that would turn my entire week into a nightmare. My name is Yates Whitman, and I run Whitman Propane Services, a company my grandfather started back in 1967. We service hospitals, nursing homes, and emergency facilities all across Travis County. That morning, my phone wouldn't stop ringing. The ice storm had knocked out power to half the city, and backup generators were running on overdrive. St. Catherine's Hospital, our biggest client, was burning through propane like crazy, keeping their emergency generators operational. I pulled my delivery truck into the Meadowbrook Heights subdivision at around 7 in the morning. The development sat right on the property line adjacent to St. Catherine's, which made it the perfect staging area for our emergency operations. We had been parking our trucks there for years during emergencies, always in the same spot on Willow Creek Drive, a quiet cul-de-sac that backed up to the hospital's service entrance. The HOA had never said a word about it before. The roads were sheets of ice. My truck, a commercial propane tanker carrying 3,000 gallons, moved at a crawl. I had 2 more hospitals waiting for deliveries after St. Catherine's, plus an assisted living facility that was getting desperate. My dispatcher, Marcus, had already warned me that we were looking at a 16-hour day minimum. I parked the truck in our usual spot, killed the engine, and checked my phone. The hospital's facilities manager, Robert Chen, had texted me 20 minutes earlier saying their main tank was at 18%. Not critical yet, but getting close. In this weather, with every generator running full blast, they would be empty by noon. I grabbed my thermos and was about to head inside for a quick bathroom break at the gas station 2 blocks away when a silver Lexus came sliding around the corner. The driver hit the brakes too hard, and the car fishtailed before coming to a stop right in front of my truck. A woman got out. She was maybe 50, wearing a puffy white coat that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. Her blonde hair was styled in that particular way that screamed country club membership and weekend wine tastings. She marched up to my window, her designer boots somehow finding purchase on the ice that had everyone else sliding around. I rolled down my window. "Morning, madam. Can I help you?" "You most certainly can help me by moving this monstrosity immediately." Her voice had that particular pitch that made my teeth hurt. "I'm Deborah Patterson, president of the Meadowbrook Heights Homeowners Association, and you are in violation of Section 12, subsection 4 of our community guidelines regarding commercial vehicles." I blinked at her. "Madam, I appreciate that, but I'm making an emergency delivery to the hospital. I'll be gone in about 2 hours, 3 at most." "I don't care if you're delivering gold to the president himself," Deborah said, pulling out her phone. "Commercial vehicles are not permitted to park on our streets for any reason. You need to leave immediately." "Look, I understand, but the hospital is running on emergency generators because of the ice storm. If I don't get them more propane, people could die. I'm not exaggerating." "Their backup power will fail." Deborah's expression didn't change. "That sounds like a hospital problem, not a homeowners association problem. You have 15 minutes to move this truck or I'm calling my towing company." "Madam, please, just let me make this delivery." "The roads are dangerous right now. Moving the truck unnecessarily puts everyone at risk, and it delays critical supplies to a hospital." She was already dialing. "You were warned." I sat there, genuinely stunned. In 15 years of running this business, I had dealt with difficult people, bureaucratic nonsense, and every flavor of petty official you could imagine. But this was something else entirely. I tried one more time. "Mrs. Patterson, I'm asking you person to person, please don't do this." Lives are literally at stake. 15 minutes, she said, and walked back to her Lexus. I immediately called Robert at the hospital. Hey, we've got a problem. The HOA president is threatening to tow my truck. She's what? Robert's voice rose an octave. We're at 16% now, Yates. 16%. Can you make the delivery before she does anything? Not if I have to move the truck. The hospital entrance is iced over on the main road side. This cul-de-sac is the only safe approach. If I move now, I'll have to go all the way around, and that adds 45 minutes minimum. Let me call her. What's her name? Deborah Patterson. But Robert, I'm telling you, she didn't care when I explained the situation. I'll call her anyway. Just stand by. I sat in my truck, engine idling to keep warm, and watched the clock tick down. 10 minutes passed. The temperature display on my dashboard showed 19 degrees, and the ice wasn't melting anytime soon. My phone rang. She's not answering, Robert said. He sounded stressed, which made sense given that he was responsible for keeping a 300-bed hospital operational during an emergency. Yates, what do you want to do? I'm staying put. She's bluffing. And if she's not, then I guess we'll deal with that when it happens. But I'm not leaving until you have your propane. Robert hesitated. Okay, I'll send someone out to the main entrance to meet you. We'll figure out a way to run the hose, even if the approach is bad. 20 minutes later, a flatbed tow truck appeared. The driver, a young guy who looked thoroughly miserable about being out in this weather, pulled up next to me. He got out, glanced at my commercial tanker, then at Deborah's Lexus parked at the end of the street, and shook his head. Man, I'm sorry about this, he called up to me. I told her this was a bad idea, but she's paying triple my usual rate. You can't tow this truck, I said. It's not safe, it's not legal, and it's going to delay emergency supplies to a hospital. The driver held up his hands. Hey, I'm just doing my job. She said she's the HOA president and you're violating parking rules. Call your supervisor, call someone. This is insane. He shrugged. My supervisor is the one who sent me. Look, I don't want to do this either, but if I don't, she'll just call another company. At least I'll be careful with it. Deborah emerged from her Lexus, holding what looked like a coffee cup from Starbucks. How she had managed to get coffee in the middle of an ice storm was beyond me. She walked over to the tow truck driver and said something I couldn't hear. He nodded and started preparing his equipment. I called Robert again. They're actually doing it. They're actually towing my truck. You've got to be kidding me. I wish I was. Okay, stay calm, document everything. Take pictures, get names, everything. We'll need it for the lawsuit. Lawsuit is great, but right now you need propane. I know. How fast can you get another truck here? I pulled up the dispatch screen on my phone. Every truck we have is out on emergency calls. The soonest I could get another one here is probably 4 hours, maybe 5 with these road conditions. There was a long silence on the other end. We'll be empty in 3. The tow truck driver hooked up to my tanker. It was a complicated process because commercial propane trucks aren't designed to be towed like regular vehicles. I tried one more time to reason with Deborah. Mrs. Patterson, please, just let me make this delivery. I'll pay whatever fine you want. I'll donate to the HOA, whatever you need. She sipped her coffee and looked at me with an expression I can only describe as satisfied. You should have moved when I told you to move. Actions have consequences, Mr. Whitman. People could die because of this. Don't be so dramatic. I'm sure the hospital has plenty of backup power. The tow truck started pulling away with my tanker. I followed in my personal vehicle, a beat-up Ford F-150 that I kept for situations exactly like this. The driver took my truck to an impound lot on the east side of Austin, about 12 miles away through ice-covered roads. By the time we got there, it was nearly 9 in the morning. The impound lot was a muddy patch of gravel surrounded by chain-link fence. A small office sat near the entrance, and inside, a woman who looked like she hadn't slept in 3 days sat behind a desk covered in paperwork. "I need to get my truck out immediately," I said. "It's full of propane that needs to be delivered to a hospital." She didn't even look up. "Towing fee is $500. Storage fee is $50 per day, prorated hourly." "I understand. Here's my credit card, but I need the truck now. Can't release it until I get the authorization from whoever called for the tow." "What? That's ridiculous. I'm the owner. I'm paying the fees. Give me my truck." Now she looked up. "Doesn't work that way. The person who called for the tow has to authorize the release. Those are the rules." I called Marcus, my dispatcher. "I need you to get every lawyer we have on retainer calling whoever runs this impound lot. I need my truck released now." "On it." Then I called Robert. "I'm at the impound lot. They won't release the truck without authorization from the HOA president." "You're joking." "I'm really not. How are your levels?" 14%. "We're starting to shut down non-essential systems. If we hit 10%, I have to start making decisions about what parts of the hospital get power." My hands were shaking, and it wasn't from the cold. "I'm doing everything I can." I called Deborah Patterson next. It went to voicemail. I left a message explaining that I would pay all fees immediately if she would just authorize the release of my truck. Then I called again, and again. On the 4th call, she answered. "Mr. Whitman, if you continue harassing me, I'll call the police." "Mrs. Patterson, I am begging you. Authorize the release of my truck. I'll pay you personally for your time. $500, $1,000, whatever you want. I'm not interested in your money. I'm interested in people following the rules. Your truck will be released when you've learned your lesson about respecting community guidelines." "When will that be?" "I'll authorize the release this evening. Around 6 o'clock, I think. That seems reasonable." "That's 9 hours from now. The hospital will be without power long before then." Then perhaps the hospital should have ensured their propane supplier understood the importance of following parking regulations. She hung up. I stood in the impound lot office, phone in hand, and tried to figure out what to do next. Marcus called back. "I've got our lawyer on the line. He says we can get an emergency court order, but it's going to take time. Couple hours at least, maybe more given the weather and the courts being slammed with ice storm-related issues." "We don't have a couple hours." "I know. What about going through the police?" "I'll try." I called the Austin Police Department's non-emergency line. After being on hold for 15 minutes, I explained the situation to a dispatcher who sounded overwhelmed and exhausted. "Sir, unless the HOA president committed a crime, this is a civil matter. You'll need to go through the courts." "But this is an emergency. A hospital is going to lose power." "I understand your concern, but we have hundreds of actual emergencies right now. Car accidents, people without heat, down power lines. A parking dispute isn't something we can prioritize." I tried calling St. Catherine's administration directly. Maybe if a hospital executive called the HOA, it would carry more weight. I got through to the chief operating officer, a woman named Patricia Vollmer. "Mr. Whitman, Robert has briefed me on the situation. I've already tried calling Mrs. Patterson myself. She won't answer. I've also reached out to the mayor's office, but they're swamped with emergency operations." "What about your emergency contacts? Doesn't the hospital have relationships with the city?" "We do, and we're using them." "But Mr. Whitman, the reality is that even with everyone making calls, this is going to take time we don't have. What other options do we have?" I thought about it. "I can try to source propane from another supplier, but everyone's slammed right now. Let me make some calls." I spent the next hour on the phone with every propane supplier in Central Texas. Nobody had trucks available. The storm had created a perfect crisis, with power outages driving up demand just as road conditions made deliveries nearly impossible. At 10:30, Robert called me. "We're at 11%. I'm starting to get pressure from the hospital administrator to implement emergency protocols." "What does that mean?" "It means we start transferring patients to other facilities if they have room, which they don't because everyone's in the same situation. It means we might have to shut down entire wings. Yates, I've got premature babies in the NICU on ventilators. I've got people in the ICU on life support. This isn't theoretical anymore." My lawyer, a guy named Tom Bradford who had handled business issues for us for years, called me back. "I've filed for an emergency order. The earliest I can get in front of a judge is 2 this afternoon. That's too late." "I'm sorry, Yates. I'm doing everything I can. The courts are overwhelmed." I drove back to Meadowbrook Heights. Maybe if I showed up in person, if I made Deborah look me in the eye and understand what she was doing, she would change her mind. The roads had gotten worse. What had been ice was now a mix of ice and sleet, with visibility down to maybe 30 feet. The drive that should have taken 20 minutes took 45. When I finally pulled onto Willow Creek Drive, Deborah's Lexus was parked in her driveway. I knocked on her door. No answer. I knocked again, harder this time. Finally, she opened it, keeping the chain lock engaged. "Mrs. Patterson, please, I'm asking you one more time. Authorize the release of my truck. I already told you 6 o'clock this evening. People are going to die. Do you understand that? Actual people, babies, elderly patients, people on life support. You're being dramatic. I'm being accurate. The hospital is at 11% propane. When they hit 10%, they start shutting down systems. When they hit 5%, they lose everything. That's less than 2 hours from now." Deborah looked at me with an expression I'll never forget. It wasn't cruelty exactly. It was indifference. She genuinely didn't care. "You should have followed the rules," she said and closed the door. I stood on her porch, sleet hitting my face, and realized that I had run out of reasonable options. I called Robert. "I need you to call the local news, all of them. Tell them what's happening." "You think media pressure will work?" "I don't know, but we're out of other options." Robert must have lit a fire under someone because within 30 minutes, my phone started ringing with calls from reporters. I gave them all the same statement. The hospital was going to lose power because an HOA president wouldn't authorize the release of a propane delivery truck over a parking violation. At 11:45, a news van from Kazan pulled onto Willow Creek Drive. A reporter named Jennifer Mills got out with a camera crew and knocked on Deborah's door. I watched from my truck as Deborah answered, saw the camera, and immediately slammed the door. Jennifer turned to her cameraman. "Did you get that?" He nodded. She walked over to my truck. "Mr. Whitman." "I'm Jennifer Mills from Kazan. Can you tell me what's happening?" I explained everything. She took notes and asked questions. The cameraman filmed the entire conversation. "Can you take us to the hospital?" Jennifer asked. "Yes." We drove over to St. Catherine's main entrance. Robert met us there, along with Patricia Vollmer and several other hospital administrators. They all looked stressed beyond belief. Patricia spoke to the camera. "We are currently at 9.8% propane capacity. We have implemented emergency protocols. If we lose power, we will be unable to provide critical care to approximately 40 patients who are dependent on life support equipment. We have nowhere to transfer them because every hospital in the region is dealing with the same weather emergency." Jennifer turned to the camera. "This is Jennifer Mills reporting from St. Catherine's Hospital in Austin. where a homeowners association dispute may lead to a loss of power during a critical ice storm emergency. We've reached out to Meadowbrook Heights HOA President Deborah Patterson for comment, but she declined to speak with us. We'll continue to follow this developing story. My phone rang. It was Tom Bradford. Turn on Channel 5. I pulled up a news stream on my phone. The story was already airing. They had video of Deborah slamming her door in the reporter's face, interviews with hospital staff, shots of the weather, everything. The comments section was lighting up with angry responses. At 12:15, my phone rang from a number I didn't recognize. Mr. Whitman. This is County Commissioner Sarah Valdez. I just saw the news report. Give me the name and number for the impound lot holding your truck. I rattled off the information. Stay by your phone, she said. 10 minutes later, the impound lot called. Mr. Whitman, you can come get your truck. The fees have been waived. I didn't ask questions. I just drove. The lot manager had my keys ready when I arrived. Sorry about all this, she said. I was just following procedure. I understand, thank you. I climbed into my propane tanker and headed back to St. Catharines. The roads were still terrible, but I didn't care. I drove slowly and carefully, but I drove. By the time I pulled up to the hospital's service entrance, it was 1:15 in the afternoon. Robert was waiting for me. We're at 8.2%. How fast can you fill us? Give me 45 minutes. I connected the delivery hose and started pumping. It was cold, miserable work. The sleet had turned to freezing rain and every surface was coated in ice. But I got it done. By 2 o'clock, the hospital's main propane tank was back to 80% capacity. Robert shook my hand. Thank you, seriously, thank you, just doing my job. It was a lot more than that. I still had 2 more hospitals waiting for deliveries, plus that assisted living facility. I got back in my truck and headed out. The next delivery was in Round Rock, about 25 miles north. The roads had gotten even worse, and it took me almost 2 hours to get there. My phone wouldn't stop ringing. News outlets from across the country were picking up the story. It had apparently hit social media hard, and people were furious. I gave a few phone interviews while I drove, always keeping my attention primarily on the road. One reporter from a Houston station asked me, "What do you think should happen to Mrs. Patterson?" "I think she should face consequences for putting lives at risk over a parking space," I said. "But mostly, I think people need to understand that HOA boards have too much power and too little accountability. This kind of thing happens all the time, just usually not with such dramatic stakes." By the time I finished my deliveries, it was almost midnight. I had been awake for 21 hours straight. I drove home to my apartment in Cedar Park, took the hottest shower I could stand, and fell into bed. I woke up to 147 text messages and 63 missed calls. The story had exploded. It was trending on Twitter. Reddit had multiple threads about it. Someone had found Deborah's Facebook page and LinkedIn profile, and she was getting absolutely destroyed in the comments. More importantly, I had messages from Tom Bradford and from a lawyer I didn't know named Sandra Guerrero. Tom's message said, "Call me ASAP. Several interesting developments." Sandra's message said, "Mr. Whitman, I'm an attorney specializing in civil rights and HOA disputes. I'd like to discuss potential legal action." Pro bono, I called Tom first. "What's going on?" "Several things. First, the hospital is filing a lawsuit against the HOA and Deborah Patterson personally for the costs associated with implementing emergency protocols, plus damages. They're estimating it at around $200,000. Good. Second, the county is investigating whether Deborah violated any emergency orders by interfering with critical infrastructure during a declared emergency. That could be criminal charges. Even better. Third, and this is the interesting one, apparently there's a revolt happening in Meadowbrook Heights. I've been contacted by several residents who say Deborah acted without approval from the HOA board. They're calling for her removal and claiming she exceeded her authority. I laughed. It was the first time I had laughed in days, so she might lose her little kingdom. Looks that way. Also, you should probably consider legal action yourself. What she did cost you time, money, and put your business at risk. Put me in touch with Sandra Guerrero. I'll talk to her about it. Sandra turned out to be sharp, aggressive, and genuinely angry about what had happened. When I called her, she dove right in. Mr. Whitman, what Deborah Patterson did to you was illegal on multiple levels. First, she interfered with the delivery of critical supplies during a declared emergency. Second, she caused you financial harm through an abuse of HOA authority. Third, she endangered public safety. I want to go after her personally, the HOA, and the towing company that cooperated with her. The towing company was just doing their job. The towing company should have refused the job once they understood the circumstances. They had a responsibility to exercise reasonable judgment, but we can talk about that later. Right now, I want to focus on Patterson and the HOA. What are we looking at? I'm thinking a lawsuit for damages, lost business, emotional distress, and punitive damages for reckless endangerment. We could be talking 7 figures if we play this right. I don't want 7 figures. I want to make sure this never happens to anyone else. Then we go after the HOA's governing structure. We get the court to impose oversight, restrict their enforcement powers, and set precedent for other HOAs. Mr. Whitman, this case could change how HOAs operate in Texas. Then let's do it. Over the next week, the situation developed quickly. The Meadowbrook Heights HOA board held an emergency meeting and voted to remove Deborah as president. Apparently, she had indeed acted without board approval, and several board members were furious that she had created a legal nightmare for the association. The county prosecutor announced that they were charging Deborah with interfering with emergency operations, a misdemeanor that carried up to a year in jail and a fine of up to $4,000. It wasn't much, but it was something. Catherine's hospital filed their lawsuit, as did Sandra on my behalf. The hospital was asking for $200,000 in damages. Sandra was asking for $1.5 million, mostly in punitive damages. But the real story was what was happening in Meadowbrook Heights itself. Turns out, Deborah had been abusing her authority for years. Once people started digging, stories came out about her fining residents for absurdly minor violations, threatening people with liens on their homes over things like mailbox colors, and generally making everyone's life miserable. A group of residents formed a committee to completely overhaul the HOA's governing documents. They reached out to me and asked if I would consult on changes that would prevent this kind of abuse in the future. I agreed. The criminal trial happened first. I had to testify, which was nerve-wracking despite the fact that I was just telling the truth. The courtroom was small, and Deborah sat at the defense table with her lawyer, a sleazy-looking guy who kept objecting to everything. The prosecutor, a young woman named Amy Reeves, walked me through the events of that morning. Mr. Whitman, when you explained to Mrs. Patterson that you were delivering emergency supplies to the hospital, what was her response? She said it wasn't her problem and that I had 15 minutes to move or she would have my truck towed. Did you offer to pay any fines or fees? Yes, I offered to pay whatever she wanted. I even offered to pay her personally. What did she say to that? She said she wasn't interested in money. She wanted me to learn a lesson about following rules, even knowing that the hospital would run out of propane. Yes. Deborah's lawyer tried to argue that she had no way of knowing the situation was as serious as I claimed, that I was just a commercial operator trying to get out of a parking ticket. But the prosecutor brought in Robert Chen and Patricia Vollmer from the hospital, who testified about the emergency protocols they had to implement and the patients who were put at risk. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. They found Deborah guilty of interfering with emergency operations. The judge sentenced her to 6 months probation, a $4,000 fine, and 200 hours of community service. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed us. I gave a brief statement. I'm glad that justice was served today, but this is about more than one person. This is about a system that gives too much power to people with too little oversight. HOAs serve an important function, but they need to be accountable to reasonable standards. What happened to me could happen to anyone, and usually there aren't dramatic circumstances to bring media attention. People are harassed, fined, and intimidated by their HOAs every day. That needs to change. The civil lawsuits took longer. St. Catherine's settled with the HOA's insurance company for $150,000. My case went to trial. Sandra was magnificent. She brought in experts on HOA governance, emergency management specialists, and even some of Deborah's former neighbors who testified about her pattern of abusive behavior. The defense tried to argue that I had options, that I could have moved my truck and found another way to make the delivery. Sandra destroyed that argument by showing that every alternative would have resulted in delayed delivery during a life-threatening emergency. The jury awarded me $850,000, mostly in punitive damages. The HOA's insurance covered most of it, but Deborah was personally liable for $200,000 that exceeded the policy limits. She filed for bankruptcy. I didn't feel good about that exactly, but I didn't feel bad either. Actions have consequences, as she liked to say. The real victory came from the changes in Meadowbrook Heights. The residents completely rewrote their HOA governing documents with input from Sandra, several other lawyers, and community organizers who specialized in HOA reform. The new rules included mandatory board approval for any enforcement action exceeding $500 in fines or fees, a formal appeals process for residents who disagreed with HOA decisions, strict limits on what violations could be enforced during declared emergencies, requirements that board members receive training on their legal responsibilities, term limits for board positions. Other HOAs across Texas started adopting similar reforms. The case became a rallying point for HOA reform advocates nationwide. Sandra started a nonprofit focused on helping residents fight HOA abuses, and I became a regular donor. 6 months after the ice storm, I was making a routine delivery to St. Catherine's Hospital when Robert flagged me down. "Hey, Yates, got a minute?" "Sure. What's up?" "The board wanted me to give you this." He handed me a plaque. It read, "In recognition of Yates Whitman, whose dedication to service and commitment to doing the right thing exemplified the best of our community during the 2025 ice storm emergency. With gratitude, St. Catherine's Hospital." I felt my throat tighten. "Thanks, Robert. This means a lot. You earned it. Listen, we're having a community appreciation event next month. Would you be willing to speak? Just a few minutes, talk about what happened and what people can do to protect themselves from HOA overreach." "Yeah, I can do that." The event was bigger than I expected. Several hundred people showed up, including local politicians, other business owners, and residents from HOAs all over Austin. I spoke for about 15 minutes, telling the story of that morning and emphasizing the importance of HOA accountability. Afterward, dozens of people came up to me with their own horror stories about HOA abuses. A man who had been fined $5,000 for planting the wrong kind of flowers. A woman who had been threatened with foreclosure over a mailbox that was allegedly 2 inches too tall. An elderly couple who had been harassed for months over the color of their front door. I listened to all of them and gave them Sandra's contact information. Several of those cases turned into successful lawsuits that resulted in more HOA reforms. One afternoon, about a year after the ice storm, I was having lunch at a barbecue place in South Austin when a woman approached my table. She was maybe 30, professional-looking, carrying a briefcase. "Mr. Whitman, I'm sorry to bother you, but I wanted to say thank you." "For what?" "I'm an attorney. I specialize in HOA law. What happened to you and how you fought back, it inspired me to start taking on more cases against abusive HOAs. I've helped about 20 families so far, and I'm building a practice around HOA reform. Your case gave me a roadmap for how to fight these battles." "That's great. Really. That's exactly what I hoped would come from all this. There's actually a growing movement. Lawyers across the country are using your case as precedent. We're winning changes in HOA laws at the state level. Texas just passed a bill that requires HOAs to have emergency exemptions for critical services. That's directly because of what happened to you." I shook her hand. "Thank you for telling me that. It helps to know some good came from it." As for Deborah Patterson, I heard through the grapevine that she moved out of Meadowbrook Heights about 6 months after her bankruptcy was finalized. Someone told me she relocated to Florida, probably to start fresh somewhere nobody knew her story. I didn't wish her ill, but I didn't wish her well either. I just hoped she learned something from the experience. The ice storm itself became one of those defining moments that people in Austin talk about. The city made a lot of infrastructure improvements afterward, focusing on winterization and emergency preparedness. Several hospitals expanded their backup generator capacity and fuel storage. My business grew substantially after all the publicity. We hired 6 more drivers and expanded our service area to cover more of Central Texas. I made sure every single employee understood that when it came to emergency deliveries, especially to hospitals and critical care facilities, no obstacle was too big to overcome. If an HOA or anyone else tried to interfere, they were to call me immediately so I could handle it. It never happened again. Turns out, once HOAs saw what happened to Deborah Patterson and Meadowbrook Heights, they became a lot more cautious about interfering with emergency services. I also started carrying copies of the Texas Emergency Services statute in my truck, the one that makes it illegal to interfere with the delivery of critical supplies during a declared emergency. On the few occasions when someone questioned where I was parked or what I was doing, I would show them the statute and explain politely, but firmly, that I was exempt from local parking regulations while performing emergency services. That usually ended the conversation pretty quickly. 2 years after the ice storm, Sandra Guerrero invited me to speak at a national conference on HOA reform in Washington, D.C. The conference brought together lawyers, legislators, homeowners' rights advocates, and people who had fought battles against their own HOAs. I told my story again, but this time I focused on the systemic issues that allowed someone like Deborah Patterson to wield so much power with so little accountability. I talked about the need for state and federal regulations to protect homeowners from HOA overreach. I talked about the importance of community organizing and legal advocacy. The response was overwhelming. People lined up afterward to share their stories and ask for advice. Several state legislators told me they were introducing HOA reform bills in their own states, modeled on the changes we had achieved in Texas. A woman from Nevada told told me that her HOA had tried to foreclose on her home over a dispute about her fence height. She fought back using strategies she learned from my case, and she won. The HOA was forced to pay her legal fees and change their enforcement policies. A man from Arizona said his HOA had been fining him weekly for having a work truck parked in his driveway. He cited the precedent from my case about commercial vehicles used for emergency services, and the HOA backed down. These conversations reminded me why I had fought so hard. It wasn't just about me or my business. It was about standing up to petty tyrants who abuse whatever small amount of power they're given. On the flight home from D.C., I reflected on how much had changed in 2 years. What had started as a nightmare scenario, being towed during an emergency and potentially contributing to a hospital disaster, had turned into a catalyst for meaningful reform. Thousands of homeowners were now protected by laws and policies that didn't exist before that ice storm morning. When I got back to Austin, I drove past Meadowbrook Heights. The neighborhood looked the same, quiet streets lined with nice houses, but I knew things were different now. The HOA operated under strict oversight, board members were accountable to the community, and residents had real recourse when they disagreed with decisions. I pulled up to St. Catherine's Hospital to check in with Robert. We had become good friends over the past 2 years, bonding over our shared experience during the ice storm. "Hey, stranger," he said when I walked into his office. "How was D.C.? Educational? Exhausting? Good. How are things here? Smooth. We upgraded our propane storage capacity last month. Now we can go twice as long without a refill, even running all the generators full blast. That's smart." "Yeah, well, after what happened, the board decided we needed to be more self-sufficient during emergencies. We've also established relationships with 3 different propane suppliers instead of just relying on you guys. No offense. None taken. That's exactly what you should do." Robert leaned back in his chair. "You know, I was thinking about that morning a lot lately, how close we came to disaster. How stupid the whole situation was. One person with too much power and not enough sense nearly killed people. But it didn't happen. We prevented it. We got lucky. If the media hadn't picked up the story, if the county commissioner hadn't intervened, if any number of things had gone differently, we would have lost power. People would have died. I know. That's why the reforms matter so much, making sure it can't happen again." Robert nodded. "I heard Deborah Patterson is trying to join an HOA board in Florida." "Seriously?" "Yeah. Someone who still lives in Meadowbrook Heights has a cousin down there. Apparently Deborah is positioning herself as an expert on HOA governance." I shook my head. Some people never learn. "Should we warn them? The internet is forever. If they Google her name, they'll find everything. If they don't bother to Google her name before putting her on their board, they deserve what they get." We both laughed, though it wasn't entirely funny. As I drove home that evening, I thought about how random events can change your life. If the ice storm had hit a day earlier or later, if I had parked in a different spot, if Deborah had been on vacation, none of this would have happened. But it did happen, and I had a choice about how to respond. I could have just paid the fees, made the delivery late, and moved on. A lot of people would have done that. But I fought back because what happened was wrong, and because I knew that if I didn't stand up to it, Deborah would keep abusing her power and someone else would suffer. That's the thing about bullies and petty tyrants. They keep pushing until someone pushes back. Most of the time, they fold pretty quickly once they face real consequences. Deborah had probably been getting away with this kind of behavior for years because nobody had the resources or the willingness to fight back. My case was different because the stakes were so high, and because the media attention made it impossible to sweep under the rug. But the principle was the same for everyone dealing with HOA abuse. Document everything, know your rights, and don't be afraid to fight back. 3 years after the ice storm, Texas passed comprehensive HOA reform legislation. The law established state oversight of HOAs, created an appeals process for residents, limited fees and fines, and made it explicitly illegal for HOAs to interfere with emergency services. It was everything Sandra and I and hundreds of other advocates had been pushing for. The governor invited me to the signing ceremony. I stood behind him with a group of other homeowners who had fought battles against their HOAs as he signed the bill into law. This legislation protects the rights of homeowners while preserving the legitimate functions of HOAs, the governor said. It ensures that what happened to Yates Whitman will never happen again in Texas. It creates accountability and fairness. This is good governance, and I'm proud to sign it. Cameras flashed. Reporters asked questions. I gave interviews emphasizing that this was a victory for everyone who had ever been bullied by their HOA. That night, Sandra and I and several other advocates went out to celebrate. We toasted our success and talked about what came next. There were still 49 other states that needed similar reforms. There were still thousands of homeowners fighting battles against abusive HOAs. You know what the best part is? Sandra said, raising her glass. We created a template. Every victory, every lawsuit, every reformed HOA provides evidence that this is possible. Other states are already looking at our law as a model. We might actually change this nationwide. Here's to that, I said, and we all drank. The years since have been good. My business continues to thrive. I married a wonderful woman named Sophie Garrison, who I met at one of the HOA reform events. She's a paralegal who works with Sandra's nonprofit. We bought a house in a neighborhood without an HOA. I still drive delivery routes sometimes, especially during emergencies. There's something satisfying about the work, about knowing that what I do keeps people safe and hospitals running. Every time I pull up to St. Catherine's with a load of propane, I think about that ice storm morning and how close we came to disaster. Last month, I got an email from a guy in Oregon who read about my case and used it to fight back against his HOA. They were trying to fine him for having solar panels on his roof, claiming they were unsightly. He cited the precedent that HOAs can't prioritize aesthetics over critical functions, and he won. The HOA had to pay his legal fees and change their solar panel policy. These stories still come in regularly. People across the country fighting back against HOA overreach, winning their battles, and making their communities better in the process. Each one reminds me that standing up to Deborah Patterson that morning was worth it. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if I had just moved my truck like she demanded. Probably nothing good. The hospital might have lost power, people might have died, and Deborah would have continued abusing her authority because nobody stood up to her. Instead, her moment of petty tyranny became a catalyst for change that affected millions of people. The HOA reform movement gained momentum. Laws were passed. Homeowners gained protections. And somewhere right now, someone is standing up to their HOA bully and winning because we proved it was possible. That ice storm was 3 years ago, but I still remember every detail. The cold, the ice, the desperation, the anger. I remember Deborah's face when she closed her door on me. I remember Robert's voice when he told me they were running out of propane. I remember the reporter's questions and the jury's verdict and the governor's signature. Most of all, I remember the decision to fight back instead of accepting injustice. That decision changed my life and thousands of other lives. It proved that ordinary people can stand up to systems that seem immovable and win. And that's a lesson worth remembering. Whether you're dealing with an HOA, a corporation, a government agency, or any other institution that has forgotten it's supposed to serve people, not control them. You have more power than you think. You can fight back. You can win. Sometimes all it takes is refusing to move your truck.